just a couple of years ago. There's a brand new thing in the world called ancient DNA. Ancient DNA is not supposed to exist. We weren't looking for it for a long time, but now we found it. And literally, 5 years, everything has exploded. It is unbelievable how much information we now have about some very, very interesting questions about history. I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much, but I do have a prepared talk, so I'm just going to go through what I have. You've all seen this before, but this is from my graduate work where I was taking DNA out of corals and engineering them into fish and bacteria. And that was my background. I was a genetic engineer, and now I am a geneticist. I don't do the wet lab stuff anymore, but I do analyze DNA, and I do read a lot of scientific papers. And it's just a lot of fun. A lot of my material has already appeared on creation.com. More of it will be appearing over time. I've probably written 5 or 6 articles on various subjects, most of them dealing with DNA, just this summer. So if you just go to creation.com and type in Carter DNA, you will come up with all sorts of interesting articles on these subjects. But for this one, we want to talk about ancient times. And we want to compare what we're learning in the ground with what the Bible claims is history. So let's turn first to Genesis chapter 10. A section of the Bible called the Table of Nations. This is describing where the grandsons of Noah, and about grandsons, went after the Tower of Babel. Now, how many of you believe that the Europeans descended from Japheth? Right, I don't believe that for a second. How many of you are not going to answer my questions when I ask you to raise your hand? Okay, so I assume, all right. that was a participatory grade. You all fail. From first reading, from first glance, and from reading a lot of historical theology, people pretty much guess that the Japhethites went to Europe because the Bible describes the sons of Japheth moving north. That the sons of Ham went to Africa because the Bible describes the sons of Ham going to Africa, and that therefore the Asians must be Semitic. Some people say, oh no, they're Japhethites also. So I'm using phrases here: Semitic, Japhethite, Hamite. That's the 3 sons of Noah: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From these 3, all the nations on earth were descended, Genesis says. So if that's true, should we expect this pattern? In the archaeology, in the genetics, would we expect that pattern? Yes or no? Who says yes? Who says no? Who's not going to answer my question? Oh, come on now. You can't see that? Oh, well, yeah, but we know where Asia, Africa, and Europe are. Sorry, Shem, Ham, and Japheth are a little too small. I didn't anticipate that. Well, the answer is absolutely not. That is not the pattern one would expect. First of all, thousands of years of history have happened since this event. Second of all, if you look at where the Bible says these people settled, red, those are the sons of Japheth. Green, these are the sons of Ham. Up into Turkey. Blue, sons of Shem. It looks like the first dictator in the world was Nimrod, who built cities up in this area. He was a descendant of Ham after the flood. The descendants of the 3 brothers are living on top of one another. They're not separated by space. You've heard of Romeo and Juliet, right? What was that? That was the children of 2 warring factions in Italy. Well, guess what? They fell in love and, tragedy resulted. But my point is, anytime you have people living next to each other, you get Romeos and Juliets. You cannot maintain genetic distinction amongst neighbors because people are people. They don't care what their parents say necessarily. Hey, that girl's kind of cute. I'm going to go hang out with her. Boom. And you're done. That's the way people are. Since there's not a geographic separation according to Scripture, and since we wouldn't expect a genetic separation because of human behavior, I would not expect the Shem, Ham, and Japheth pattern. But it gets even worse than that. My Y chromosome comes from William Thomas Carter. As far as I know, he was the first William Thomas Carter. My cousin is William Thomas Carter the fifth, and he named his son Billy also, so there's at least 6 of them in a row. I'm a third. I'm a Robert William Carter the third, but I couldn't keep up with my cousins, so I named my kid Ethan. Oh well. Point being, I know where my Y chromosome comes from. It comes from Northern Ireland. It comes from the county of Donegal. That's Ireland, but the county is north of the country of Northern Ireland. It's on the far west, northwest of Ireland. I share my Y chromosome with a couple million Irish men, and it's been associated with a famous Irish chieftain who lived in like the 800s or something like that. So I know where I come from. And if you graph my Y chromosome, this group R1b, the name is relevant, but that's the group I belong to. Actually, it's R1b1, b1, b2, a star. Something like that. So I'm on a group of a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup of a subgroup. If you graph where my group is in the world, R1b, yeah, look at that. It lights up Western Europe, just like it's supposed to. Like 80% of Western European men are in one of those subgroups under R1b. But what's that spot in Central Africa? That's south of Lake Chad. That's in the country of Cameroon. Those men have the darkest skin of any men on the planet. And they're my cousins. I would be more closely related to one of those men than to other Irish men who don't belong to group R1b. Hey Christian, what's a race? We can't define it genetically. And we get all these puzzles and things popping up that make no sense. But I'm going to explain where group R came from at the end, and you'll be like, oh. But skin color does not define races. All right. We're going to talk about history, though. We need a timeline. So let me give you a timeline of biblical history. I'm rounding everything off to the nearest 500, basically. So creation is a little more than 4,000 BC. The flood is about 1,600 years later. Abraham is right about 2,000 BC. Moses is right about 1,500 BC, middle of the Bronze Age. David is in the middle of the Iron Age, about 1,000 BC. Now, of course, Jesus is at 0, and today is about 2000 AD. Simple enough? I like this concept in my brain because when I'm reading biblical history and world history, I put things into that context. I mean, I like knowing that the fall of Troy was around the time of Moses. I like knowing that the 300 Spartans who defended against the Persians in Thermopylae was 500 or 600 BC. That's Queen Esther's time. It was after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. I like doing that history and just putting in context. So there's a context for you. Everything we talk about now is in that context. We have to explain Neanderthals in this context. We have to describe the rise of races in this context. Everything, 7.5 billion people have to fit into that timeline. You think we can do it? Sorry. Enter ancient DNA. Now, for a long time, no one even bothered to look because we know that DNA breaks down very rapidly. It is a long molecule. It's very thin. It's very sticky. Oxygen destroys it. Water destroys it. There is no reason to suspect that DNA lasts. And then a scientist in about 1984 said, hey, how long could it even last 100 years? No way, no, that can't last 100 years. But he went to this museum display of a quagga, which is extinct, and it's like a donkey zebra. I mean, it's one of the horse kind. They no longer exist, but they had a museum display of one, so he goes and takes a skin sample, and he pulled DNA out of it. What? So we had, from 1983, or 1984, a record of a 150-year-old animal with DNA. What's the next question? Well, how far back can we go? What about dinosaurs? Well, in the 1990s, a claim of dinosaur DNA came out, and it was a mistake. Apparently someone had been eating a ham sandwich in the DNA extraction lab, and it was not dinosaur DNA that they had sequenced. Well, that was bad for the whole field, because that set us back another decade. No one wanted to touch ancient DNA because of the contamination problem. And it prevented what we now know, literally stalled it by at least 10 years. And then someone said, can we pull DNA out of a Neanderthal bone? Oh, don't do it, man. You know the ham sandwich fiasco. It's like, yeah, I know, but I got these Neanderthal bones and I'm working in the DNA lab. Let's try it. And, well, most Neanderthal bones had no DNA, but one of them did. And they sequenced the mitochondrial genome out of a female Neanderthal buried in a cave somewhere in the middle of Europe thousands of years ago. And it was not at all like a modern human mitochondrial DNA. And they said, see that evolution? Neanderthals split off from humans hundreds of thousands of years ago, before we even became Homo sapiens. And then they sequenced more Neanderthal, and then more, and then they did an entire genome of Neanderthal, which wasn't very good, and then they did a high-quality genome, and then they did 20 or 50 high-quality genomes, and then finally, after all this work, they finally found a boy. It was the weirdest thing. All these ancient genomes that they're pulling out, they're all female. So what's going on? The probability of having 20 females is 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. It's like, where are the men? And finally they got a partial Y chromosome of Neanderthal, and it was way different than modern man. And they said, see that? Human history says Neanderthal split off from modern man like 300,000 or so years ago. Maybe longer, because their DNA is so different than ours. And this is a major challenge. And honestly, it was a challenge. Except just in the last year or two, someone resequenced that Y chromosome to a high quality standard, and they found out that it was modern. The first Y chromosome from Neanderthals was garbage. And that's a problem with ancient DNA. It's decayed, it's decrepit, it's broken up into little teeny pieces. In fact, you cannot assemble ancient DNA unless you have something to compare it to. So once you have the human genome, you can take these little pieces of Neanderthal and line it up on the human genome. If you didn't have the human genome, you'd have random bits of DNA and you couldn't line them up. And so it's difficult because of the decay problem. But now, today, we have DNA. Ancient horses, cave bears, mammoths, mastodons. We now know how different mammoths and mastodons were from modern elephants because we have their DNA. This is really cool. And then something happened. Somebody realized that the inner ear bone, called the petrous bone, the hardest bone in the body, has about 100 or 1,000 times more DNA than other bones in the body. And so all those Neanderthals they were looking at an arm bone or something like that, and they found no DNA. They might, and very often, have found DNA in the skull, in that one bone. And that opened up a floodgate of research. Tremendous amount of, there's so much data coming down now from ancient DNA. You can probably download 1,000 ancient DNA genomes from people all throughout the fossil record. Mostly in Europe, because Europe is colder, and most of the laboratories are European. Africa, they've got a couple of ancient skeletons in Africa, but not really ancient, like maybe 2,000 years, maybe. And it's tricky because Africa's so warm, it's not a place for DNA to be preserved. Caves in Siberia, great place to preserve DNA. The open plains of Africa, lousy place. So the information we have is sketchy. But as I said, DNA breaks down very rapidly. There's a couple things that happen. One, DNA cross-links quickly. That is a photograph of a chromosome from an ancient Egyptian priest. We even know his name. And look at the chromosome. It's all spider-webbed. It's cross-linked. Second thing that happens to DNA. This is the most common chemical reaction that happens to DNA. It's also the most common mutation that happens in the human genome. The letter C in DNA, A, C, G, and T, is short for cytosine. is cytosine on the top here has an NH2. It's an amine group. It's like ammonia. Ammonia is NH3, or an NH2 is an amine. It sticks off the top. Well, if water attacks that, it'll rip off the amine, and now we have a different letter. This is the letter U, uracil, which is an RNA. When uracil is found in DNA, the DNA repair system says, what's this U doing here? It doesn't belong in DNA, and so it fixes it. But very often it fixes it as a T. So the C to T mutation is the most common mutation sitting in this room right here. But the C to U mutation, because there's no DNA repair happening in something that's dead, lying on the ground, is the most common mutation. And it happens quickly. And DNA is fragile. This long molecule breaks often. In your cells, you have about 1 million DNA lesions per day. And your body is constantly fixing the broken and the mutated DNA. And if you didn't have exquisite DNA repair systems, you would be dead very quickly. But God engineered amazing systems to prevent us from falling apart. In fact, you get basically every single cancer every single day, multiple times a day. But your body usually fixes it. That's really neat. We can measure DNA decay rates in a laboratory. I don't want to go through all the numbers here, but just understand that at like 15 degrees Celsius, which is 70-ish, about 70 degrees, your DNA will completely decay, so there's not even 2 letters stuck to each other, in 131,000 years. Well, that means that dinosaurs would never have DNA. And that means that Neanderthals would not have DNA. But even at below freezing, it might take a long time. They're estimating 6.8 million years for complete destruction. But even that, you can't sequence the DNA way before you get to complete destruction. To sequence DNA, you have to have an enzyme grab onto the DNA, which means you need space. It has to be able to slide along the DNA also, which means you have something to read. So by the time you get down to 20 letters or less, it's completely unreadable. You might as well say there's no DNA there. Your DNA, and it's 6 feet long. Chromosome 1 is 250 million letters long. It's a foot long. I mean, thin. I mean, you can't even see if you stretch it out, but it's a foot long. That's chromosome 1. When they sequenced the first Neanderthal genome, the longest section they found was about 50 letters long. It's just on the edge of being sequenceable. Just on the edge. And they sequenced it and they said, wow, this has got a lot of mutations. But then they said, oh, look at that. Most of like the C to T mutations and things like that, they're at the ends. So what if we just cut the ends off? Now we've got 20 letters. We sequenced it. So, oh, we have the human genome. Let's look on the human genome and find, oh, there it is right there. Stick that piece there. And what they do is they do what's called shotgun sequencing. They just sequence millions of little pieces of DNA and then use a computer program to attempt to line it up on the human genome. And first of all, it was shocking that it worked. Second of all, it was shocking that they were so human. They were clearly human. I mean, all the parts about the modern human genome that separate us from chimpanzees are in the Neanderthal genome. They have the FOXP2 gene, which is what we have, which gives us the ability to speak, etc., etc., etc. They're clearly human, and their DNA was almost totally degraded. All right, so how do they do this? This is absolutely amazing. First of all, you extract the DNA in a sterile laboratory. How many of you have heard of, oh man, what was that? The little people they found in South Africa a couple years ago. The what? No, not Big Feet. It wasn't Denisova. I just did a talk on it. I don't know. Anyway, they found these short-statured people in a cave in South Africa. And they hired some cute girls to do the excavation, as in they couldn't find any skinny guys who like caving. You don't know, they hired these girls for the photo ops, and they crawl into this cave, and they're pulling out these bones, and they're holding them in their hand. And I went, oh, they destroyed it. Because as soon as you touch something, the DNases in the oils in your skin will penetrate the bone and destroy any DNA in the bone. but they weren't thinking there was DNA in the bone. But they should have been, because the ancient DNA revolution was still already going on. They should have known. Homo naledi, that's what it was. But Homo naledi, as far as I'm aware, the bones have been destroyed. They should have had masks on. They should have been wearing gloves. They should have been bagging these things as soon as they got them, putting in preservative solutions, but they didn't. But if you have an uncontaminated bone, you bring it back to a laboratory, clean room conditions, sterile everything. You extract the DNA using chemicals. It's really trivial. DNA is a molecule. We know its properties. You can extract it. Alcohol is part of the process. Water, I mean, easy. You just pull it out. And then you have a machine that makes a whole bunch of random pieces of DNA, like a barcode. And you take those and you add it to the ends of your DNA. Use a little bacterial enzyme. It'll just take a little piece of DNA and stick it on the end. Now they're tagged. You have barcoded your DNA. And then you put it in a machine that makes copies of it, because there's not a lot of DNA in ancient DNA. There's not a lot at all. In a bone that has DNA in it, if it's ancient, there's only going to be a little bit of DNA. But you put it in a machine called a polymerase chain reaction machine that just makes lots of copies of the DNA. And now you have lots of copies of whatever's in there, and most of that is going to be modern bacteria. Hopefully none of that is modern human who touched the bone. But most of it will be modern bacteria, and there's bacteria that live in the soil. But we know what their sequences are, so we can just delete those. And you have to authenticate it. And you authenticate it by doing a couple things. One, you delete anything that's long. Two, you delete anything that doesn't have a lot of mutations in it. So all the short pieces that are highly broken down, oh, that's ancient DNA, we think. So there's an art to this. You have to say, okay, at what level do we reject or accept it? And depending upon where you draw that line, that will affect your results. So there's a little bit of art here. And then you trim the ends off, and you have a little piece of DNA, and you line it up. That's how they do it. This is brilliant. And the first person who said, I want to do this, people said, don't bother. That's a career-ending move. You'll get nowhere. And he's right now the king of the ancient DNA world. Thousands upon thousands of samples, multiple people across the world doing ancient DNA studies, and his name's on almost every one of the papers. Got lucky. Oh, remember I said there was old dinosaur DNA claims back in the 90s? Well, new ones are coming out also. Just the year 2020. Evidence of proteins, chromosomes, and chemical markers of DNA in exceptionally preserved dinosaur cartilage. Now, chemical markers of DNA, I would kind of expect that. I don't expect intact DNA to be in a dinosaur bone. If those things died in a flood, man, that was 4,500 years ago. That's a long time ago. DNA doesn't last that long. But the nucleotides might still be around, so there should be some chemical evidence of DNA, possibly. However, if I'm wrong, maybe there is DNA there. But notice they didn't try to sequence this DNA. They just said, oh, there's chemical markers of it. One reason for that is because whoever sequences dinosaur DNA is going to, a firestorm of controversy will erupt around that person. And Mary Schweitzer, who is the person who first started publishing the soft dinosaur tissue stuff, well, she's the one who discounted the dinosaur DNA paper from before that. So even she, who's doing all the soft tissue work on dinosaur soft tissue, I don't think she's going to dare to try to sequence it, because she already slammed a guy's reputation who tried it before. There's politics here. But if you take a dinosaur cell, a dinosaur cell? Yeah, if you take material from a dinosaur bone and pull the cells out, I can't leave a ham sandwich on the counter for a week before it starts turning green. You think I could bury my ham sandwich in my backyard for 100 years and expect to find anything in it left of it? No way. How about 70 million years? There should be nothing left. Bacteria eat everything. I am incredulous. I think this thing is thousands of years old, and I'm still having a hard time believing that they find intact cells. But when you do extract the intact cells, and you stain it with some stains that stain DNA only, oh, look at that, it lights up what looks like a nucleus. So it looks like DNA is intact in dinosaurs. It's just a matter of time before someone is brave enough to actually pull it out. Well, that's not too surprising, because here's a report from Mary Schweitzer in 2013. The stain is on the left. That's for DAPI. That's a stain I've used in the laboratory. It intercalates inside the DNA double helix, and when you wash your specimen with water, the DAPI stays there, shine ultraviolet light on it, and DNA glows green. Boom, looks like a nucleus. But bacteria have DNA, so anticipating an objection, they said, oh, let's use another stain that stains the histone proteins. That's the DNA the protein that you have. Your DNA wraps around histone proteins inside your nucleus. Humans have it, reptiles have it, bacteria do not have it. And sure enough, that in red lit up what looks like a nucleus. So it looks like there is intact DNA in dinosaurs. We just have to wait and see if someone's going to be brave enough to see it. Now, I do know that some creationists have tried to do this. And there's a tremendous traffic accident, and the samples in the cooler melted, and the people went to the hospital with broken bones and things like that. That was a sad story. Or maybe we'll try again. Okay. You all believe me that ancient DNA really exists? Now let's see what it can tell us about human history. I'll give you a couple case studies. First, consider the Native Americans. Not very much genetic diversity. All the mitochondria, all the Y chromosomes clearly go back to a small group of people. It really does, and the DNA that they have, it matches people living in Siberia today. So it really, really, really does look like they came across a Bering Land Bridge. I mean, honestly and truly, this looks like where these people derived from. Just like I'm looking at you in this room, I know where you came from. You came from Europe. Because your DNA matches Europeans. Now, if someone who's not European in the room, forgive me, but I'm just kind of guessing based on the average face I'm looking at. Right? If I can guess where you come from, well, we can do the same thing with Native Americans, and it really does look like they came from Asia. The earliest skeletons that we found are controversial. There was a skeleton found in Kennewick, Washington. That's on the Columbia River. If you go down the coast of Washington, there's a pass where the Columbia River comes through, and you can go there. You can go way into the interior of the continent. And Kennewick, Washington is on that, and they found a man. And this is really controversial because people said, oh, look, he is European looking. The oldest people in the Americas were the Europeans, not the Native Americans, and all this politics and all this wrangling and all this arguing. And the Native Americans are like, excuse me, who dug up one of our graves? You can't do that. Give us the bones back. We're going to bury it. You're not allowed to do that. And so the scientists and Native Americans and everyone's fighting, and they said, tell you what, let's take a little bit of bone sample and run the DNA, and then we'll give you the bones to bury. Okay. And it was really good of this to happen, because the DNA in those bones matched very closely several of the tribes living in Washington today. Clearly it was a Native American, not a European, and clearly he was the ancestor of the people that now live there. And that was really cool. And they buried the bones, and bones are now decaying in the ground. Did we lose scientifically? I don't think so. Did we lose culturally? I don't think so. But grave robbing is a massive problem, especially in the 1800s, when the Europeans specifically didn't think anything of going to Australia and shooting someone and dragging their body back to Europe, or defleshing them and bringing the bones back to Europe, or digging up a grave. Tons of grave in South and Central America, Native Americans, African, you name it. The Europeans, anthropology back then, you cannot separate the word racism from the word anthropology. However, I hope we're getting a little better. We as in a European. Let's talk about East Asians now. I said the Native Americans look like they came from East Asia, but not the Chinese population. No, not even the Mongolian population. Some of the Central Asians, in other words, they were used to down into the Americas, and then some other group moved up in between them. Well, the East Asians, as far as we can tell, they've been in place from the beginning. Specifically in China. Now, the Chinese population has spread out and displaced a lot of people. You go to Malaysia, you go to Indonesia, pretty much anyone living along the coast is probably 100% Chinese, even though they've been there for 1,000 years or more. But the people living in the highlands of those islands, they tend to be the original people, so the Chinese spread. It's not even, Chinese isn't even the right word, but I'm just using colloquialism. But they found a bone. They dated it to 40,000 years ago. Now, I of course don't agree with this date. This is a post-flood human, an early post-flood human living near modern-day Beijing. And they sequenced the genome from that individual, and he was clearly related to the people living in Beijing today. Clearly. I mean, you do a comparison of all the people in the world. It goes, bink, and he lines up right next to the modern Chinese, the Han Chinese. And he's more close related to them than to the Native Americans. So this has happened after the Native Americans and the Asians split. This person was there. This is really cool. This is a history that happens here. And all sorts of weird history and interesting history that we can learn from studying DNA. Okay, now I'm going to major on Europeans because, first of all, personal interest. Second of all, because we have more information about this in the other group. And third of all, I'm going to challenge you Europeans. You're not actually European, but we'll get there in a second. First, did the Europeans come from Japheth? Well, not really. Because that map I showed you, Ham lived in Turkey. And the Turkish farmers, the Anatolian farmers, Anatolia is the name for Turkey, they pushed up into Europe, going up through Romania and up the Danube, up into the European plain, Germany and France. So that means that the sons of Ham were probably amongst them. Plus, when we look at archaeology, now I don't agree with the dates, but I pretty much agree with the order. We know when the linear ceramic culture was there. We know when the bell beaker people were there. We can tell the archaeological order of events easily, especially when they're piled on top of each other. Especially if these people never appear beneath these people, you know these people are later. Well, when we look at the skeletons of these people, and we now have many hundreds of them, they didn't carry the genes for light skin and light hair and light eyes. They were, light skin and light hair. Many of them had the genes that cause blue eyes, but dark skin. The dark skin gene was predominant in Europe until pretty late in history. Why are Europeans so light-skinned today? And there was a massive population replacement. An invading army came through and killed off the original population. That's what the DNA and the archaeology is telling us. This is really cool. In fact, there's one part. We know the first people living in Europe were Neanderthals. Period. But the Neanderthal Y chromosome branches off from the African group, which seems to be Hamitic. So it might be the first people in Europe were from Ham. Maybe. Don't know, but maybe. And then another group of people move in. And they don't completely kill off the Neanderthals, they intermarry with them. So it might have been a perfect mixture where you had a small Neanderthal group, and we know they were small, and a larger group comes in and they completely mix, or more than likely there's lots of warfare and lots of murder, because that's human history. But then another group comes in, and they came up in two different ways. The Anatolian farmers, they came up from the east, and they went across the Mediterranean, came up from the west, and when they met in France, we can see the archaeological remains, we can see the DNA, we can even tell the difference between the eastern and the western peoples. And they're different from the earlier people living next to them that didn't have farms yet. They're called them hunter-gatherers. Those are the dark-skinned Europeans. They were more different than modern Europeans are from Chinese people. And they amalgamated to become modern Europeans. So if modern Europeans are mixtures of people groups that are more different than what we today call races, what's a race? Cool question, isn't it? Some scientists studying, doing some archaeology in a Danish bog, they found this piece of birch tar. This is the toothpaste of the ancient world. People chewed birch tar a lot. And yeah, it's blackish, or at least it's blackish because it picked up the tannins in the water. But they noticed tooth marks on it. And said, oh, teeth marks in an anaerobic acidic environment, this is a perfect place to put DNA. And so they sequenced the DNA out of this lump of gum and found duck DNA, hazelnut DNA, in other words, the last meal of a woman who had dark hair, dark skin, and blue-eyed genes. I'm sorry, but that's one of the coolest things I've ever heard. And it's a beautiful picture. I love that picture too. That's, of course, an artist interpretation. But these are the so-called hunter-gatherers. They're fishing. They're hunting. They're collecting shellfish. They're eating berries. They had a very diverse diet. Think Native Americans. Especially Native Americans before the European contact, where we probably lost 95% of the Native American population. But they were very smart people living off the land. And if you're dumb, you die. The environment kills you. You have to be really intelligent. Thinking ahead, 6 months from now, the ground is to be covered with snow. How many hackberries do I need to survive the winter? And boom, we had DNA from this girl. The oldest people in Europe actually didn't even look like Neanderthals. Call them Homo heidelbergensis. They look actually more modern than the Neanderthals do. The classic Neanderthal shape with the no chin and the slope back forehead and the strong bones and the thick teeth, those are the last Neanderthals. The earlier ones, it's hard to tell the difference. They're just different looking. It's as if Neanderthals were a racial, I hate to use that word, but I think you understand what I mean by now, a cultural racial group, an inbred population that stayed together for a long time. But genetically, they estimate there might have been at most, at any one time, maybe 3,000 Neanderthals. And we're talking a range going from Spain to eastern Siberia. Thousands of miles extent and only a few thousand people. And they lived like Ice Age conditions. These people were not stupid. That would kill you and I. I couldn't survive that. They knew how to. So, using evolutionary numbers, and I don't agree with the dates again, but the order of events is probably true. About 40,000 evolutionary years ago, we have non-Europeans in Europe. About 35 evolutionary thousand years ago, the Western hunter-gatherers move up into Europe. About 9,000 evolutionary years ago, the early European farmers from the southeast. This is where the light skin color gene comes from. SLC245A or A5, whatever that is there. I'm trying to read it and say it at the same time. That is the predominant genes associated with the light skin color in Europeans, and it does not appear in Europe until the farmers move in a long time after people started living there. Have you ever heard of Otzi, the Tyrolean Iceman they found on the border between Switzerland and Italy? It was a man who was frozen. He died on the mountain, and then with global warming or something like that, the glacier pulls back, and there's a guy in a depression. They're like, holy mo! Sorry. They said, wow, wow, look at that. This person is really old. And it turns out he is one of these early European farmers. Blew our minds about what these early people were like, because he had tattoos. He had an arrow shaft made of two different types of wood, so it could break off. He had perfectly waterproof boots. He had broken bones that had healed. He was carrying a pouch with ashes in it. It looked like embers. He was carrying his fire with him. He had another pouch with mushrooms in it. But those mushrooms are a remedy for pinworms. And he had pinworms too. So he knew medicine. And on all these, like, what? And he also been stabbed in the back shot with an arrow, and the arrow was still lodged in him, and it had not healed. So, and we knew what he had for his last meal at lowland, and we knew where he grew up because of the ratio of the different elements in his bones. You can tell what water he was drinking as a child. And he was carrying this light-skinned gene, which is late in history. So about 5,000 evolutionary years ago, we had this Bronze Age migration from the Asian steppe. The steppes are the vast grasslands like north of the Caspian Sea. And this is where we get modern European DNA. Probably where we get the Indo-European languages. The corded ware culture comes into Europe. We have the Yamnaya culture it really does look like ancient Europeans were living in Asia. And we were living there, and we invaded Europe and took over. That's what the data are telling us. And this is really interesting. Hey, European, kind of looks like here, doesn't it? Take away the farms. This is where we came from, but only in Asia. That purple area looks like the central location where the Yamnaya culture developed. And from there, this might have been the people that invented the horse. And I mean invented the horse. Ancient horses didn't have strong enough forelimbs to bear a rider. They had to breed horses with strong front legs. Once that happened, you could ride the horse. And then they invented the wheeled wagon. And when they hitched up the wagon to the horse, the archaeology disappears. Before that, they were making like towns. After that, they were just ranging around on the steppes. It's like they stopped building cities, the craziest thing. And it looks like these people pushed west and east and south. That's us. Is this biblical or not? Yeah, it's biblical. After the Table of Nations was written, we have about 4,000 years of history. Massive migrations of massive groups of people. The Jews come up into Europe. The Gypsies, they call them Roma today, they come up into Europe. In fact, the Roma population today is actually larger than several of the member states of the European Union. There's more Roma than people in Denmark. It's a massive group of Eastern people living in Europe. The Mongols invade in the 1300s. They sweep from the east. In fact, if the Khan had not died back in Mongolia, we would not be speaking English today. They had a 5-year plan for conquering Europe. And they were ahead of their plan. They were besieging Vienna when the Khan died. And the brothers had to go back and elect a new Khan, and they started a little civil war. That's why the Mongols left. That was just the last of the great Eastern invasions. And there's so much more evidence. Oh boy. All right. I told you about the broomstick model earlier. And after I described this, I showed you a picture of the mitochondrial family tree. This time I'm going to show you a picture of the Y chromosome family tree. Now I made the next slide. Took a long time again. But before we go there, let me just remind you that you're about to see a bunch of these broomsticks in a diagram. And when we're looking at this, we have to understand that these are people. The modern people that were sequenced are represented at the end of these tips. Ancestors are here, where any of these branches come together, that's an ancestor. And then way back at the beginning is the ultimate group ancestor. Now there's probably were spur lines that happened here, 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 and here, and here, but those people just didn't leave any descendants. But this happens in small populations, by the way. In small populations, most people actually don't leave DNA. But this is our broomstick model. Now here is several hundred Y chromosomes from the Simon's Genome Diversity Project. That looks like that explosion I showed you earlier with the mitochondrial tree. Same picture. A rapid expansion of humans from a central source. Now again though, the longest branches are in Africa, but this is the Khoisan Bushmen, the Pygmies in Central Africa. They have the longest branches. But this group run right here, this group, E1B1A, they just renamed it, but I'm used to calling it E1B1A. This is 95% of modern African males. But their cousins, E1B1B, that's not African. E and D, these are not Africans. Genghis Khan belonged to group C. So 95% of African males split off from non-Africans, and they split off from non-Africans, and they split off from non-Africans. This did not arise in Africa. This group arose outside of Africa and then invaded. And look how short their branches are. They all go back to one guy. If this is the flood, then this guy lived a few thousand years after the flood. And there's a giant replacement in Africa. If mutation rates are constant. Now, I don't believe mutation rates are constant, especially because of patriarchal drive and things. So these branches might be overly inflated. This might be 1,000 years after the flood instead of 2,000. I don't know, pick a number. But point is, these people did not rise in Africa, even though they live there today. There was something in history called the Bantu Expansion. You know the Zulu Wars? Right? The British fought these two giant wars with the Zulus, and they lost at Rorke's Drift, but they won at Islwanda. I can't pronounce that. But you know the stories? Well, what happened was when the Dutch got to South Africa, they started looking east and said, wow, there's 100 miles of open grassland free for the taking. And the Dutch moved into that area, the Boers. The problem is, on the other side of the grassland were the Zulus. And the Zulus had killed off everyone within 100 miles of the Zulu homeland. And they kept it empty. And the Dutch walked into a bloodbath that the English then inherited. But the Zulus were the end point. They're the furthest south and east of the Bantu expansion. The Bantu languages started in Central Africa. And they swept eastward and southward. And they killed off everyone in their path. There's a couple, like the pygmies in the rainforest, they survived. And there's a couple of hunter-gatherer people up in like the Kenya area. And then you've got the Khoisan in southwest, and like Namibia, west of South Africa. They still hung on. But pretty much they exterminated everybody else. Notice I just said the Europeans exterminated everybody else. The Africans exterminated everybody else. You can't find a people group that didn't kill off everybody else. The reason anyone's alive today is because their ancestors won. Just look at human history. Battle after battle after battle. But just going around this, a lot of Jewish men are in group J. Now it's not J for Jewish, it was just because. By the way, these aren't necessarily in order because this is they're named after their discovery in order. So A was then B, and then they found C, then they found D, then they found E, then they found G. So they're named in order of discovery. But J, a lot of Jewish men, so is that Japheth? Because, no, sorry. Is that Shem? Of course, you're like, what? This guy's an idiot. Yes. Is this Shem? Because Jewish people descend from Shem. The men do. Oh, this is Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. Notice this fan. You see that fan? This beautiful V shape. And all these long branches that go way deep. That is caused by a population that has been in place for a long time. It's just grown and grown and grown and grown and grown. Small populations, a lot of people don't live, so the branches get pruned. Like these guys. Weird branching patterns. But a population is growing in place for a long time. You get this starburst pattern. And then we get Q, Native Americans. All of them, as far as we can tell. R1A, India, Pakistan. R1B, Eastern Europe. Notice, Europeans, Pakistanis and Indians, Native Americans. Cool. Totally, amazingly, unbelievably interesting. The Native Americans are more closely related to Europeans than Europeans are to Chinese people. I'm sorry, I love history. And I love genetics, because genetics in one sense is a study of history. Two famous geneticists, Slatkin and Racimo, said this, 2016. We now know the present-day populations were created by a complex history of admixture and population movement. Although local genetic continuity over long periods has been documented in a few cases, these are exceptional. The general rule is that the ancestors of the present-day population live somewhere else. So when you say, I'm European, say, hey, great. That means you come from the steppes of Asia. And all of a sudden you're like, what? No, I'm from Europe. No, you're not from Europe. Come from somewhere else. Back to Neanderthals again. Said all that already. Let's introduce you to the Denisovans. The Denisovans are an ancient group of people discovered starting with a teeny little finger bone from this cave in eastern Siberia. It turns out that a lot of Melanesians have a lot of Denisovan DNA. In fact, just last week a paper was published about the Negrito population. I said that because I don't want to say Negrito because it sounds too much like Negro, but in Spanish it means black. One of the populations, or a broken up population in the Philippines, have dark skin, curly hair, and they have the highest rate of Denisovan ancestry that anyone's ever seen. So they descend from Denisovans, who started off in a cave in Mongolia. Also, the high altitude adaptations we see in the Tibetan population, like I could not live in Tibet. It's just too high. Most of us, we can't tolerate that altitude. Our blood starts producing too many red blood cells and gets clogged up. But there are a couple of mutations in some people that allow them to thrive at that without too much red blood cells. And we see it in Tibetans, and we see it in the Denisovans. And in this cave, they found a girl who is half Denisovan and half Neanderthal. No, wait a second. We'd already kind of guessed that there had been interbreeding between these people groups, between modern humans and all these groups and those groups with themselves. But over thousands of years and millions of people who had ever lived, what's the probability you're going to find that person who's half and half? Like 0? Of finding a needle in a haystack? And we only have a few dozen of these skeletons and boom, we found one right away. But the girl was not closely related, the Neanderthal part wasn't closely related to Neanderthal that was buried 3 feet away. Oh no, the Neanderthal part was related to the Neanderthals of Croatia. Wow. And if you started here, Croatia, excuse me, I was pointing in Israel. Croatia, did anyone else catch that? What's the probability if you started walking here and you just started walking across Asia that you're going to stumble upon this one cave on the border with Mongolia? You would never, ever find it. That means that this Neanderthal population, they knew where each other were living. That means they could migrate from one place to another. More than likely, they blazed the trail, marks on trees or something like that, so they could walk. And you can't walk into Asia and not get lost unless there were signs, which means they had to be intelligent. All right. All that said, 1, believe it or not, ancient DNA exists. 2, ancient DNA tells us a lot about history that is fascinating history. 3, it does not contradict biblical history if we take off the time frame. Most of these dates are based on carbon dating, and carbon dating should be amplified as you get closer to the flood, because we know Earth's magnetic field is decaying exponentially. It's been decaying exponentially since we started measuring in the 1800s. And if you go back in time, earlier the magnetic field would have been stronger. That prevents cosmic rays, which are charged particles coming in from outer space because of moving charged particles, make a magnetic field, they're repelled by the Earth's magnetic field. There should have been less carbon-14 in the atmosphere early post-flood. So if we measure anything at the flood or right after the flood, it should look older than it really is. So I have no problem contracting the evolutionary dates. The order is not a problem. The time frame is a problem, but their own time frame is contradicted by the presence of ancient DNA. It should not be there. Maybe they're not really as old as they think. Now, we should expect curveballs, and I just threw you some curveballs. That whole European story, what? We should expect curveballs because this is a brand new field. Now, interesting, this might be the first time in history where we have more data than theory. And we're collecting data like crazy, and the analysts are having a hard time figuring out what story to tell because everything keeps on changing. Again, lots of other topics. We're about to break into a Q&A. I'm not sure we'll have a break in between, but we're going to have a Q&A session. Ask me anything you like. There are so many other interesting topics in creation. You might not be interested in DNA. Maybe you like history, maybe you like linguistics, maybe you like archaeology, Egypt, cosmology, aliens, all sorts of different things. The resources are right there for the taking. We also have our website, creation.com. We have our magazine, Creation Magazine. We have the Journal of Creation, which you can sign up for. We have DVDs on DNA, like Mitochondrial Eve and the 3 daughters, and quote, daughters-in-law really, of Noah, or the high-tech cell, where I'm talking about DNA. I put an entire chapter in Evolution's Achilles' Heels about genetics because it was so profoundly powerful. On creation.com, we also have a streaming service, not like $5 for forever like Netflix or something like that, but you can stream individual titles. And the first one we ever had was one that I made myself called The Historical Atom, Theological Conundrums and Scientific Implications. That is there for free. Just go click on it. It'll be like a $0 thing in the thing, and you can watch this for free. Really cool presentation. I really enjoyed doing that. A lot of what I just said is in there, so if you want to hear it again, that's a good place to look. In fact, a lot of what I said in my second talk this morning is also in there. If you need a refresher, just go to creation.com, type in Historical Atom on our web store. All right, I'm going to leave you with this again, because I love this verse. In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. I really tried hard to model that. I don't like snark and I don't like sarcasm. That really turns me off. And when Christians shout sarcastic facts at people, I don't know, man. I don't like that. So I try to talk calmly when I can. And I try to respect people when I can. I give them props when they deserve it. But if they need to be contradicted, I'll do that too. So, what is the order of events here? Who's the timekeeper? Do I break into the Q&A time, or do we take a 15-minute break? Dun, 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 dun. Who's going to make the decision?
You guys need a break? No? Okay.
All right.
You got your answer.
Okay, here's the rules. You will not insult me if you have to take a break. I mean, we know where the restrooms are. Feel free to exit through the bookstore as that goes. I'm going to open myself up for any question you like to ask. But just like earlier, a couple of rules. Please stay away from theological questions that really don't apply to Genesis. If you do ask me one, I might skip the question, or I might answer it as vaguely as I can. I don't want to divide the audience. I'm assuming that there's going to be some COVID-19 questions. I don't want to answer them because we've spent so much time. I mean, you can imagine how much time, maybe you can't imagine, because we're the scientific organization, the number of questions we get every single day, and I'm answering the same question multiple times a day on email or on an article. We have a very, very long article about vaccines on our website. Just type in vaccines on creation.com.